I kissed my superior officer in a moment of weakness. Tell me, what's the craziest thing you've ever done? Like, hands down, the most dead-brained idea you've ever conceived and executed. For some, it might be taking their parents' car on a joyride. For others, it might simply be skipping school for romantic pursuits. For me, it was sneaking off a US military base. Yep, no gimmicks, no skits, a legit military base. Today was as good as it got for me. It just had to be today. 2 parties were taking place all at once tonight. One for the foot soldiers like myself, another for the higher-ups and high-ranking military officers. I was betting on this rare night of merriment to keep everyone distracted from my plan to escape the base. This was as bad ideas went, because if I got caught, getting shot at or being court-martialed would be the least of my problems. What if they thought I was a spy? Or worse, what if they thought I was selling state secrets? No, I couldn't think like that. I couldn't plan to fail. The first part of my plan had already gone off without a hitch. I already covered the distance of half the base, and I was slowly closing in on the chain-link fence that separated me from the outside world. When I heard the news last week of the party that was to take place today, I knew it was the perfect time to execute. I had been tampering with a section of the fence for a while now. I would weaken the links in the least guarded section of the fence daily. It was not anything significant enough to cause an immediate break or visible damage, just enough to allow me to force it open when the time came to make my escape. A night just like this one. To be honest, my time here hasn't been all bad. The obvious trauma aside, I would definitely miss a few people. The Lance Corporal in charge of my unit, for instance. He was everyone's dream back at camp, charming and athletic, not to mention compassionate. Lance Corporal Jake didn't seem to live off the negative energy that the other high-ranking officials did. He was always willing to lend a listening ear no matter what the problem was. Anyways, he was one of the few people I would miss. I was hoping to at least get with him once more, but luck didn't seem to be on my side, unlike last time. 11 months ago, he and I had been set on an assignment. Nothing over the top. It was a simple delivery that played out great. The only issue was our extraction vehicle radioed in and informed us of a day's worth of delay due to extreme weather conditions. Ever since then, it had been nothing but exchanged glances and nods between us. He never spoke about that night, and neither did I, but I was hopeful. Maybe one more time I could be with him, before I put this aspect of my life behind me. Focus, Miles, focus, I chided myself. There was no time to be spacing out. All that stood between freedom and me was this fence. I would be damned if I let it or the beautiful memories with the Lance Corporal stop me. After looking over my shoulders to make sure no one was watching me, I kicked at the weakened section of the fence, and I felt it give way beneath the weight of my boot, but not completely. Damn it, I cursed silently. Kicking the fence had caused a bit of a ruckus, and as much as I didn't want it to happen again, I didn't have much of a choice. Taking a deep breath, I kicked at the weakened fence once again, with all the strength I could muster squatting on one leg. Yes, I mentally cheered as the chain link gave way and my foot tasted freedom on the other side, but my joy was short-lived. What the hell do you think you're doing, Private? A cold hand wrapped itself firmly around the back of my neck, its fingers digging firmly into my flesh. I asked you a question, Private. The voice lowered to a cruel whisper. I couldn't believe it. I hadn't made up an excuse or a plausible explanation for if I was caught. My heart pounded as my brain worked overtime to come up with a believable excuse. Naturally, I came up short and empty-handed. Resigned to my fate, I turned around to face my captor. Shockingly, it was none other than Lance Corporal Jake Warner. His eyes, usually warm and understanding, were now steely and piercing. What were you thinking? He demanded, his grip tightening momentarily before he let go. My throat felt dry, and I was acutely aware of the cold sweat forming on my forehead. Lance Corporal, I... Jake seemed to understand, or at least sympathize with the turmoil I was in. His expression softened slightly, and he sighed. Do you have any idea how dangerous this is? There are foot patrols for over 5 miles. If you're caught, they'll shoot you on sight. His words cut through the fog of my panic, bringing me back to the grim reality of my present situation. I nodded mutely, unable to meet his gaze. Come on, Jake said, his voice gentler now. Let's go to the mess hall before anyone sees this, he said, gesturing to the now ruined fence. I spared one last look at the gaping hole my flawless plan had caused on the chain-linked fence. Defeated, I followed Jake to the mess hall, all the while thinking about what would happen next. Would he report me? I felt like the world was collapsing around me. Once we were seated in a secluded corner of the mess hall, Jake looked at me with an intensity that was reserved for torture and interrogation. All right, Private, spill it. What the hell were you thinking? And why shouldn't I go running to administration? My fingers trembled as I fidgeted with the hem of the tablecloth in front of me, my throat dry and tight. I can't take it anymore, sir. My voice trailed off. Lance Corporal Jake raised an eyebrow in questioning. Can't take what? I took a few seconds to gather myself. The trauma, the constant fear, the nightmares. I feel like I'm losing my mind. I don't think I can cope anymore, sir. Jake didn't flinch. He probably heard sob stories like these every other day. I think I know what this is. You miss your family and would like to go see them. I shook my head. He was way off. I don't think I have anyone to go back to, sir. I just wanted to leave here so I can start over and find some kind of peace. Jake listened, his expression shifting into something unreadable. He leaned back in his chair, contemplating my words. There are proper channels, you know, he said finally. Administration can help. You don't have to sneak around. I shook my head, my voice cracking. I'm sorry, sir. Those channels take forever. Heck, if I manage to get out, what if they just call me back into active service a few years later? I can't handle that. Jake sighed, rubbing his temples. I understand, Private. I really do. But running away isn't the answer. You'll only put yourself in more danger. I looked down at my hands, noticing the way that they were trembling. I never wanted to be here in the first place, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I joined the military because I had no other options. I thought it would be a way to just survive, to get by, but I never expected. My words trailed off, my mind flashing back to the horrors I had witnessed as part of the army. My breath hitched, and I felt tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. I've seen things, sir, I continued, my voice shaking. Things that haunt me every single day. I can't sleep. I can't think straight every time I close my eyes. It's like I'm right back in the middle of it. I'm at my breaking point. I don't know how much more I can take before I keel over. Jake leaned forward, his expression softening. Private, for what it's worth, I'm sorry. Service can be tough, especially for those who aren't entirely clear of what they're getting themselves into. I think with time and a little help, you might... I shook my head again, cutting him off as my hands clenched into fists. I don't want to be here, sir. I don't want to fight anymore. I just want to feel safe, to not wake up every day dreading what might happen next. I wiped at the tears that had begun free-falling from my eyes. There was a long silence. Then Jake leaned forward, placing his smooth palm on my forearm. Listen, I won't report you, but you have to promise me you won't try anything like this again. I'll see how I can help you get out without having to run away. My heart began racing once again as my brain registered the intimate position his hand had taken up on mine. Thank you, sir. Jake smiled, his pearly whites on full display. You will get through this, Private. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I can help you with therapy sessions in my free time, but you need to trust me. I looked at him, gratitude seeping out of my pores. Thank you, sir. I don't know what to say. Just promise me that you will give my way a try, he said, his gaze unwavering. I promise, I said, my voice steady for the first time that night. I won't miss a single session. 2 weeks later. 2 weeks slowly passed since my failed escape attempt. True to his word, Jake had formally submitted a letter, alongside all the necessary documents asking for a termination of my service due to mental health reasons. But like all things paperwork, the process was ridiculously slow. On the upside, Jake kept his promise for the therapy sessions, and it was like nothing I had ever experienced before. In place of a stuffy office, Jake's sessions were held outdoors or in the empty mess hall while he completed his duties or while I completed mine. They didn't even feel like clinical therapy sessions, and they were twice as effective. Despite his rank as Lance Corporal, it was very easy to talk to. He had a way of making me feel seen when I spoke. Jake paid such rapt attention that it was sometimes hard to focus on what I was trying to say when his bright eyes locked onto mine wholeheartedly. I'm sorry, sir, but I can't concentrate with you staring at me like that, I said in resignation. I had been trying to recount some of my fondest moments from here. It was our exercise for today. I would share my top 3 moments here that I wouldn't trade for anything. What? How? How am I looking at you? Jake laughed, his airy voice filling the mess hall with its melody. It's that thing that you do with your eyes. Look, you're doing it right now. I pointed at him as his eyes continued to attempt to subdue mine. "It's called paying attention, Miles. I tend to do that to the things or people I'm interested in," he carelessly shrugged. But I, on the other hand, was having a meltdown. Did Lance Corporal Jake just say he was interested in me? I needed to know for sure. "I'm sorry, sir, but are you sure it isn't some psychology trick you picked up to freak out your patients?" I asked, hiding my intent with a bit of humor. Lance Corporal Jake held up 2 fingers. "First off, I don't have patients. I don't consider the people who need my help as patients. I find the term a tad degrading. Secondly, I believe I told you that when we have our sessions, I'm just Jake. Not Lance Corporal, and definitely not Sir." He finished pointedly with his fork aimed at me. I stopped myself from throwing a quick salute in response. This had to be what I enjoyed the most about our sessions. It wasn't a doctor and a patient, nor a Lance Corporal and a private discussing. It was simply 2 men who had seen a lot of messed up things and needed a shoulder to lean on talking. I continued telling Jake about my top 3 moments here. The first being when I completed basic training. The second being when I saved Trevor from being blown to bits by a landmine. And the third? Well, the third was when Jake and I slept together on that assignment. But I doubt he remembered that. Plus, I don't know how he felt about that particular incident. I wouldn't want to dredge up our sour memories and ruin the mood. Jake looked at his wristwatch, and a small frown crossed his face before vanishing like it was never there to begin with. "I've got an errand to run before the night runs out. Care to join me?" I playfully made a show of thinking it over. Besides, we had put rank aside for our sessions. I don't know, Jake. What's in it for me? I can already barely stand being here. Why would I want to take on any more work?" Jake smiled. He was impressed, but I didn't know if it was for standing up to him or for something else entirely. "Well, Miles, I'm but a simple man who doesn't have much to offer." I opened my mouth to cut him off and tell him there was no chance in hell I'd be helping him then, but Jake beat me to it. He raised his index finger, silencing me effectively. "I'll tell you the one memory I have of this place that keeps me going." My ears visibly perked up at his word. Jake might have been a great listener, but he was a closed book. He never shared more than he was required to, and it could be very frustrating seeing as he constantly made me share sensitive information about myself and my life so far. "You're serious? No jokes? Because I swear to God." "Miles, I mean it," he said, stretching out his palm in a handshake. I took the hand without hesitation. "You've got yourself a deal, Jake." Jake led me out of the mess hall and through the left wing of our camp. As we walked, he began to open up about himself and his early life. He talked about how he had lost both parents to substance abuse and found himself roaming the streets of New York at a very tender age. I was surprised to learn just how much we had in common. Like me, Jake had been an orphan who joined the military to escape life on the streets. But Jake had made different choices along the way, finding a way to navigate the system without losing himself entirely. After walking for the better part of 7 minutes, Jake and I arrived at a restricted wing of the camp. I had never been past the barricade before because of my rank. We entered a canopy-like building, and I was shocked to find it was a greenhouse. The place was filled with neat rows of lush and lively greenery, a glaring contrast to the drab and utilitarian surroundings of the military base we resided in. Jake told me it was his personal project that the higher-ups had greenlit. He then instructed me on the watering techniques for different rows and sections. We started with the larger plants, ensuring they received a deep soak, and then moved on to the more delicate seedlings that required a gentler touch. Jake explained the importance of each type of plant, sharing his knowledge with a passion that was beyond infectious. Together, we got to work. The tasks were simple, but required a steady hand and patience. We worked in relative silence, the only sounds being the soft trickle of water and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was peaceful, almost meditative. And for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. As we concluded the greenhouse duty after an hour, I remembered that Jake hadn't told me about his fond memory. I turned to him, curiosity evident on my face. "You never told me about that memory, Jake." Jake sighed, a conflicted look crossing his face. It's something I'm not very proud of, Miles. Despite it being a fond memory, I loathe myself because I enjoyed it so much. And I find myself wanting to do it again." My interest was piqued, so I put the watering can down and moved towards his section of the greenhouse. "Come on, man, surely it can't be that bad." I tried to cheer him up, because it was a little unnerving to see the pillar of a man downcast. Jake's frown morphed into a hesitant smile. "Well, it was during that assignment we had a while back. You know, the one where we ended up sleeping together." I froze, my mind racing. "You remember that?" "Every detail," he said, his bright eyes once again holding mine captive. My breath hitched, my heart pounding in my chest. "Was it that bad? Is that why you're not proud of it?" Jake shook his head as though he was correcting a child. Far from it. I know we were a tad drunk, but the intensity of those emotions that night is imprinted on me. It's gotten me through some difficult times, and I'm sorry if you feel like I might have taken advantage of the entire situation that night. My eyes widened in realization. He felt guilty about that night. He probably thought he had contributed to my reasons for leaving this place. I stepped up to Jake urgently. Ever since that night, Jake, I've wanted nothing more than to spend another night with you again. Jake looked at me in disbelief. You're not mad at me? Instead of answering with words, I closed the gap between us and kissed him. It was a gentle kiss, filled with all the emotions I had been bottling up for so long. Jake hesitated for only a moment before kissing me back, his hands finding their way to my waist, pulling me closer. I've had dreams that started off like this, Jake commented as we broke apart for air. Yeah? Me too, I replied as I tugged off my shirt. 1 week later. I won't even lie. Ever since Jake and I had gotten unofficially back together, life at the base no longer seemed so bad. Don't get me wrong, I'd be out of here in a heartbeat the moment I was cleared to leave, but being with Jake had begun to make the wait a lot more bearable. The days that followed after our first night at the greenhouse were filled with stolen kisses and risky makeout sessions around camp. We literally couldn't keep our hands off of each other, and we were almost even caught by another soldier one time. Luckily, Jake's reputation inspired fear and respect, so the soldier who almost walked in on us didn't even consider that we might have been getting intimate with each other. As the week rolled to a close, I was eager for our greenhouse meetup. As I strolled past the guard, he gave me a crisp salute, and I threw one back at him lazily. In his eyes, I was an unfortunate private who had gotten in trouble and earned myself some extra chores. Walking into the greenhouse, Jake was already there, tending to the saplings. The moment he heard me walk in, he met me halfway and greeted me with a kiss that made me dizzy. For a moment there, I thought you were going to bail on me, he smiled challengingly. I wouldn't miss this for the world, I responded, capturing his lips again to drive my point across. As we broke apart, I made a beeline for the equipment box. Grabbing the trowel, I began to list off some of the ideas I had been tinkering with for transplanting and fertilization. Jake placed a hand on my shoulder to grab my attention. Miles, there's something I've got to tell you. My application to delist has been approved? I asked with wide eyes. Jake shook his head solemnly. Not yet, I'm afraid. So what's the matter? I asked, not imagining what the problem could possibly be. Jake took the trowel from my hand and set it down gently. I've been given a new assignment to oversee an inspection on another base. I'll be gone for a week. A sense of dread washed over me, but before I could fully process it, Jake stepped closer, his expression softening. He wrapped his arms around me, pulling me into a deep, lingering kiss. The world outside the greenhouse spun before it eventually faded away as we got lost in each other's embrace. Jake's hands explored the length of my back, and I could feel the heat of his body through our uniforms. There was a mix of urgency and tenderness in the exchange. I hoped to convey how much I would miss him. He was the only reason why these last weeks had been bearable. We spent the evening wrapped up in each other, taking our time to savor every moment. We moved from the saplings to the larger plants, our hands intertwined as we worked side by side, occasionally stealing kisses and soft touches from each other. As the night peaked, we finally sat down on a bench nestled among the greenery. Jake held me close, his fingers tracing patterns on my arm. I'll miss you, Miles, he whispered. I'll miss you too, I replied, my voice barely audible over the hum of the greenhouse lights. 2 weeks later, I found myself sitting in front of the now mended fence I had once tried to escape through, my uniform covered in dirt from top to bottom. The fence looked as sturdy as ever, mocking my previous attempts at freedom. Speaking of freedom, admin had caught wind of my application for delisting, and unsurprisingly, it was rejected. But it didn't just stop there. They were now making me do all the disgusting work around the camp. Cleaning latrines, scrubbing floors, and picking up trash had become my new daily routine. I guess it was their way of punishing me and reminding me who was in control now that Lance Corporal Jake was off the base. Speaking of Jake, it had been 2 agonizing weeks with no word from him. The rumors flying around were relentless and cruel. Some said Jake was missing, while others said that he was dead. Even the other military officers whispered that he had likely deserted. I was beyond appalled at the lack of intentional effort to find him. It seemed like no one cared, like his disappearance was just another blip on the radar of military life, just another name on a long list of soldiers who had vanished into thin air. I stared at the fence, frustration building up inside me. If only he hadn't stopped me. Damn it, Miles, you're just being ungrateful, I warned myself. Lance Corporal Jake Warner had done for me what no one else had ever cared to do in my 26 years of living, and if I could go back to that night at this fence, I wouldn't change a darn thing. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms as tears began to stream down my eyes. It seemed all hope was lost, and the dark thoughts Jake and I had tried to push away began to resurface. I couldn't stay here, especially not without him. I couldn't continue to be a pawn in this twisted game of chess. If the system wasn't going to help me, then I had to take matters into my own hands. 3 days later. The idea of escaping had never truly left my mind, and right now it seemed like the only option. I began to meticulously plan an exit strategy once again, taking into account the failures of my previous attempt. This time, I wouldn't just wing it and try to pass the fence. I would be prepared, and I would find a way to disappear without a trace. If Jake was out there, I would find him, and if he wasn't, then at least I'd be free from this nightmare. I spent every spare moment analyzing the camp's routines, noting down every guard shift, every patrol route. I gathered supplies discreetly, hiding them in places no one would think to look. My new scheme was nothing short of genius. In a few days, soldiers from my unit would be tasked with a supply run. That would be my opportunity. I would stage an accident, and then flee to the border and slip into Mexico. The plan had a lot of moving parts, but it was a lot more solid than my last attempt. It just had to work. As I sat outside the latrines, staring into the distance, a shadow loomed over me. I looked up, half expecting to see a superior officer ready to dole out more punishment. Instead, it was a fellow private, one I barely knew, but his expression was one of excitement. "Bennett, you heard?" he asked, his voice tinged with urgency. "About what?" I asked, not bothering to hide my lack of interest. "Lance Corporal Jake has returned," he said before breaking into a sprint towards the infirmary. I watched him go, a lump forming in my throat. Jake was back? Jake was back! I got up and took off after the private that had just delivered the news. 2 minutes later. The infirmary was caught in its usual flurry of activity as I burst through the doors. The piercing scent of antiseptic filled the air, but I paid it no mind as I frantically began looking around. Startled nurses turned to look at me, their expressions conveying annoyance, but I wasn't there for them, so I paid them no mind and focused on the face I wanted to see. Jake was propped up on a cot in the far corner of the room, looking both spent and relieved. His once neat hair was now a little overgrown and a tangled mess, his face dirty and bruised. Bandages were wrapped haphazardly around his torso, stained with fresh blood. His left arm was in a sling, and his entire body seemed to be covered in a patchwork of new scars and cuts. Despite it all, the sight of him alive made my heart soar. "Jake!" I called out, my voice cracking with emotion as I rushed to his side. "Miles," he replied. His voice was weaker, but unmistakably his. He looked at the nurses and spoke firmly. Can we have a few minutes, please?" The nurses exchanged glances amongst themselves, clearly reluctant to leave their patients unattended. One of them finally stepped forward, her brow furrowed. "Lance Corporal, you're still in critical condition. We can't—" "Please," Jake cut in, his eyes pleading. "Just 5 minutes. I need to speak with him." After a moment more of hesitation, the nurse nodded. 5 minutes, but not a second more." She turned to the others and signaled them, and they reluctantly filed out of the room, leaving us alone. I dragged a chair and sat down beside him, my eyes scanning every detail of his injured form. "Jake, what happened to you?" He took a deep breath, wincing slightly as he shifted. "Our chopper was hit by an RPG. We went down in a river. It was chaos, Miles. I thought that was it." His words trembled slightly, and now that I was close to him, I noticed the fresh scars on his body. A deep gash ran down his right cheek, and his torso was a mess of bruises and cuts, some of them fresh, others healing. I could only imagine the pain he must be in. "I'm just glad you're alive," I whispered, reaching out to gently touch his hand. "You're alive, Jake." "Yeah," he nodded, a small smile on his lips. "Barely. I was lucky. Some locals found me and got me to their village. They patched me up as best they could before the medics here took over." Tears stung my eyes as I looked at him, so vulnerable, and yet so incredibly strong. "I was scared, Jake. They said you were missing, maybe dead. I didn't know what to think." "I know," he said softly, squeezing my hand with what little strength he had. "I'm sorry, Miles. I didn't want to leave you in the dark, but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Those words stung more than they should have because there was something I had to tell him. "I'm leaving here, Jake," I said, bringing my voice down to a whisper. Jake's eyes widened in shock. "What do you mean? Do you remember what happened last time?" I gently placed my hand on his. "I do, but this is different. I'm not going to be caught. I just need you to come with me." A small frown settled on Jake's face. I didn't let it stop me. I pressed on. When you went missing, everyone here was content on moving on. They barely spared any resources looking for you. They don't care about us, Jake. There's no point being here. Miles, if you're caught, I won't get caught. I unintentionally raised my voice, anger getting the best of me. Time's up. The lead nurse walked back inside, gesturing at me and then at the door. I nodded, standing up reluctantly. Exactly a week from now, Jake. Meet me at the loading bay if you've changed your mind. He gave me a small nod, his eyes never meeting mine. I'll think about it, Miles. Just be careful. 1 week later. Just as I had suspected, I wasn't granted access to see Jake anymore. I didn't know if it was the nurses or a direct command from the higher-ups, but it was fine. I didn't need to see him just yet. I spent the coming week finalizing my preparations. I volunteered to go on supply runs with other units, so I could get a lay of the land outside the base and establish contact with someone on the outside myself. It wasn't the easiest of tasks, but my second supply run with them, I was able to establish a means of communication with a farmer named Pedro. It would be my ticket to crossing the border. Today was D-Day, and I was a nervous wreck. As the last light from the sun disappeared into nothingness, I knew that any moment now, I would have to move. I just needed to hear from Jake. Looking down at my watch, I saw I had less than 30 minutes before I missed my window of opportunity. I tried to steady my heart rate as I crouched behind the supply shed. Every rustle of leaves, every distant sound had me on edge. I glanced at my watch again, my time running out. Suddenly, I heard hurried footsteps coming in my direction. I tensed, ready to hightail, but then I saw Jake. Miles, please, he said, slightly out of breath. Reconsider. There's got to be a cleaner exit. Jake, I've thought this through. I can't stay here any longer. I shook my head resolutely. Jake grabbed my arm, his grip firm but not harsh. Miles, please. We've proven that we can make this work together. The vulnerability and conviction in his eyes were enough to calm the storm inside me, if only for a moment. I can't stay, Jake. This place is killing me, and it almost killed you, too. I know that, but I took an oath, Miles. I'm bound by duty. I sighed tiredly, my shoulders slumping in defeat. It was clear there was no convincing him. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small notepad and pen. Here, I said, scribbling down a number. This belongs to my friend in Mexico. His name is Pedro. Give it a call in a week. I'll be there by then and settled. Jake took the paper, his hand trembling slightly. Miles, are you sure? I nodded. There was no turning back for me now. I promise. I'll quit the military the right way and come find you because after my injuries heal, I won't be fit for active service. We'll meet again, under better circumstances, Jake said as tears began to stream down his eyes. I gave him a hug and placed a kiss on his forehead before jumping into the supply truck. Jake raised his good hand in a wave. Stay safe, Miles. I held his gaze for a moment, grateful for the short but beautiful time we spent together. You too, Jake. I'll be seeing you. Conclusion. It wasn't as easy as I hoped, but I eventually made it all the way to Mexico with Pedro's help. And exactly a week later, I received a call from Jake. It took a year, but he was eventually released from active service because of his injuries. He spent a few months back in New York to throw them off, before relocating to Mexico to join me and the new life I had begun as a farmer. And well, romance was always on the way for us. The end. If you were in Jake's shoes, would you leave with Miles? Thanks for watching. Consider subscribing to become a part of our Rainbow Force and to stay wholesome.